What if everything we believed about the first Americans was written in the wrong chapter of our story? What if the footprints we've been told mark humanity's arrival on this continent were merely the most recent set pressed into ancient Earth that had already known countless others before them? Tonight, we're going to explore something that sits uncomfortably at the edge of accepted history, something that whispers from stone tools buried impossibly deep, from cave walls painted in pigments that refuse to fit our timelines, from fragments of bone that carry genetic echoes we weren't supposed to hear. We're going to ask what it means if humans reached South America not 13,000 years ago, as your textbooks insist, but perhaps 80, 90, even 100,000 years before the moment we've agreed to call the beginning. If this kind of history calls to you, the kind that refuses to sleep quietly in the margins we've drawn for it, then perhaps you'll consider joining us here. Like and subscribe, but only if you're drawn to the questions that don't resolve neatly, only if you feel the pull of mysteries that expand rather than contract with scrutiny. And tell me, wherever you are in this world right now, tell me in the comments where you're listening from, because this story belongs to all of us, to every corner of this planet where human feet have walked and left their silent testimony in earth and stone. The narrative you've been given is clean and linear. It goes something like this. Humans evolved in Africa, spread gradually across the old world, and then, in a relatively recent pulse around 15,000 years ago, crossed the Bering Land Bridge into the Americas. The Clovis people, with their distinctive spear points scattered across North America, were the first. Before them, these continents were empty of human presence, pristine wilderness waiting for our species to arrive and name it, claim it, fill it with our stories. But what if that story is not the beginning, but merely a remembering? What if it is the latest chapter in a book whose earlier pages have been torn out, scattered, buried so deep that we've convinced ourselves they never existed at all? In the arid highlands of Brazil, in a place called Serra de Capivara, there are rock shelters whose walls bear witness to something our timelines cannot easily accommodate. The paintings there, ochre and charcoal figures dancing and hunting across stone, have been dated using methods that should be reliable, methods that measure the decay of elements in the minerals that overlay the pigments. Some of these dates come back at 25,000 years old. Others suggest even greater antiquity. And below the painted shelters, in the stratified earth of careful excavations, there are tools, stone flakes, and worked cores that appear in layers dating back 50, 60, even 100,000 years. The archaeologists who work there will tell you these dates. They will show you the stratigraphic columns, the careful records of what was found at which depth, the laboratory reports with their plus or minus margins of error. And then, often, they will watch as the academic establishment dismisses their work, suggests contamination, questions methodology, or simply falls silent, because what these dates suggest is heretical to the story we've constructed. They suggest that humans, or something very much like humans, were in South America tens of thousands of years before they were supposed to be anywhere near the Americas at all. Imagine holding one of those stone tools now. Feel its weight, the deliberate flaking along one edge where some conscious mind, struck stone against stone to create a cutting surface. This is not a natural object. This is intention made manifest, purpose frozen in volcanic glass or quartzite. And it was placed in earth that formed during a time when, according to our maps of human migration, our species was still confined to Africa and perhaps just beginning to probe into the Middle East and Southern Asia. Who made it? Who walked those highlands when the climate was different, when the Amazon basin held other secrets, when the world was configured in ways we can only reconstruct through pollen cores and ice records? The questions multiply when we turn to the coast, to a site called Monte Verde in southern Chile. Here, in waterlogged peat that preserves organic materials with unusual fidelity, excavators found the remains of a settlement. Not just tools, but the foundation timbers of shelters, plant remains that tell us what people ate, even a footprint, the actual impression of a human foot pressed into clay beside an ancient hearth. The radiocarbon dates are clear and multiple and consistent, all clustering around 14,500 years ago. This alone was enough to overturn decades of Clovis First orthodoxy, because Monte Verde is in southern Chile, nearly at the end of the continent, and if people were there 14,500 years ago, they must have entered the Americas significantly earlier to have had time to travel that distance, to establish themselves, to develop the local knowledge evident in the plant species they harvested. But even Monte Verde, now cautiously accepted, is not the deepest layer. Below the main occupation level at Monte Verde in older strata, there are suggestions of earlier human presence, dates that push back to perhaps 30,000 years, though these remain fiercely debated, published but not embraced, acknowledged but not integrated into the grand narrative. And then there are the footprints. In White Sands, New Mexico, in the dried bed of an ancient lake, there are trackways preserved in stone that was once mud. These are not ambiguous. These are human footprints, clear impressions of feet, of different sizes suggesting adults and children, walking together across wet sediment. Seeds from aquatic plants embedded in the same layers have been radiocarbon dated, and those dates come back between 21 and 23,000 years old. 23,000 years. During the last glacial maximum, when ice sheets smothered Canada and much of the northern United States, when the Bering Land Bridge existed but the corridor between the ice sheets that was supposed to be the route into the Americas was sealed shut, choked with ice thousands of feet thick, impassable. And yet there are footprints, human footprints, in New Mexico. The scientists who published this work used multiple dating methods, checked and rechecked, because they knew what they were claiming. They knew how it would be received. And still, the footprints are there, locked in stone, undeniable in their shape and pattern, impossible to explain away as anything other than what they appear to be. How did they get there? If the corridor was closed, if the Bering crossing was theoretically possible but the route south was blocked, then where did these people come from? Perhaps they came by sea. Perhaps they followed coastlines in boats, hugging the edge of the Pacific, moving southward along the Kelp Highway, harvesting marine resources, stopping at river mouths and protected bays, slowly over generations, making their way down the western edge of the Americas. This is the theory now gaining traction, the coastal migration model, and it makes sense given the evidence, given the dates, given the footprints in New Mexico and the settlement in Chile. But if coastal migration explains people being in the Americas 20 or even 30,000 years ago, what explains the tools in Brazil that are dated to 3 or 4 or 5 times that age? We pause here, don't we, at the edge of comfort. We feel the ground becoming uncertain. Because if those Brazilian dates are even partially correct, if even the most conservative estimates from Serra de Capivara hold up, then we are not talking about a slightly earlier migration. We are talking about a completely different human story, one in which the Americas were reached not once but possibly many times by different populations in different epochs, separated by tens of thousands of years. We are talking about arrivals so early that they precede the development of the full suite of modern human behaviors we associate with the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. We are talking about journeys made by people who may have been anatomically modern but culturally distinct from any group we have clear records of, people who navigated oceans and continents we assumed they never saw, using technologies that have dissolved almost entirely into earth and time. Consider the genetic evidence because it too refuses to behave according to script. When scientists sequence the DNA of ancient remains and contemporary indigenous populations across the Americas, they find patterns that mostly support a relatively recent entry, a founding population that diverged from East Asian ancestors somewhere between 15 and 20,000 years ago. This is the main signal, the loudest genetic voice. But there are quieter voices, anomalies in the data, lineages that don't quite fit, haplogroups that appear in unexpected places or at unexpected frequencies, traces of admixture that suggest contact with populations we have no other record of. Some researchers have proposed ghost populations, groups that contributed genetically to later people but left no archaeological trace, or whose traces we have not yet recognized. And then there are the truly ancient remains, the few individuals old enough to have their DNA sequenced and compared. Luzia, the skeleton from Lagoa Santa in Brazil, dated to over 11,000 years old, had cranial features that looked more like those of indigenous Australians or Africans than like those of later Native Americans or modern East Asians. For years, she stood as an enigma, a morphological outlier that suggested perhaps an earlier migration from a different source population. Later genetic studies have complicated but not entirely resolved her story. The DNA tells us she belongs to lineages ancestral to later Native Americans, but the physical appearance raises questions about variation, about selection, about whether the founding populations of the Americas were more diverse than we've imagined. What if Luzia's people were descendants of an earlier wave, one that had been in the Americas long enough to develop distinct physical characteristics adapted to different environments? What if her bones are whispering to us about arrivals we've erased from the timeline? Look at the distribution of certain cultural practices, certain symbols and technologies that appear on both sides of the Pacific at times that don't align with our models of contact. The use of specific geometric patterns in rock art, the occurrence of certain types of watercraft, the knowledge of medicinal plants that grows from similar ecosystems. Some of this can be explained by parallel invention, by the idea that humans in similar environments facing similar challenges will independently develop similar solutions. But all of it? Every coincidence, every similarity, always independent, never indicating contact or shared deep ancestry. We are told that before sustained European contact in the 15th century, the Americas and the rest of the world were separated, isolated for over 10,000 years. And yet Thor Heyerdahl sailed a balsa raft from South America to Polynesia to prove it could be done. And while his specific theories of settlement direction were largely disproven by later evidence, the journey itself demonstrated that ancient people with simple watercraft could have made such crossings. If Polynesians reached Easter Island, one of the most remote inhabited places on Earth, by 300 CE, and possibly made contact with South America as suggested by the presence of sweet potatoes in Polynesian agriculture, then why is it so difficult to imagine earlier mariners, from any number of coastal peoples around the Pacific Rim, making similar journeys in deeper time? The ocean is not a barrier. It has never been a barrier to humans with intention and knowledge. It is a highway, a connection, a medium through which culture and genes and ideas flow, however slowly, however sporadically. And if the ocean was crossable 5,000 years ago, or 3,000 or 1,000, why not 20,000 years ago, or 50 or 80? We know that Homo erectus, a species that preceded modern humans, reached islands in Indonesia over 1 million years ago, crossings that required watercraft of some kind, however rudimentary. We know that modern humans reached Australia by at least 65,000 years ago, a journey that absolutely required boats capable of open water crossings, because even at the lowest sea levels, there was no land bridge to Australia. If our ancestors could cross the waters to Australia 65,000 years ago, could they not also have crossed the Pacific, however accidentally at first, carried by currents and storms, landing on shores they did not expect, sometimes perishing, sometimes surviving, sometimes establishing small populations that would persist for a time or fade away, leaving only the faintest traces in stone and bone and earth? Think about what it means for a population to leave an archaeological trace that survives tens of thousands of years. Think about the conditions required. The right soil chemistry to preserve bone, the right sedimentation patterns to bury artifacts without destroying them, the right geological stability to keep those layers undisturbed until modern excavators arrive with their trowels and brushes and GPS units. Most human presence leaves no permanent mark. Most camps, most journeys, most lives dissolve into the landscape within generations. Wood rots, fiber disintegrates, even bone crumbles in acidic soils, and stone tools, unless distinctively shaped, can be mistaken for naturally fractured rock. So when we do find something, when we find a worked stone or a hearth or a footprint preserved against all odds, we should understand that we are seeing not the totality of human presence but the tiniest fraction, the improbable survivors, the 1 in a million moments when conditions align to save evidence. How many settlements have eroded away along coastlines that are now underwater, drowned by the rising seas that followed the end of the last ice age? How many river valleys that were once rich habitats are now buried under hundreds of feet of sediment or scoured clean by millennia of flooding? We search for the past with the understanding that most of it is gone, irretrievable, and what we find is almost certainly not representative of the whole. It is the accident, the exception, the miracle of preservation. And if the few Brazilian sites with anomalously old dates are the exceptions, what does that say about the rule? What does that say about the possibility of earlier, widespread human presence that simply did not happen to get preserved in contexts we've excavated, or that we've excavated but misinterpreted, or that we've found but rejected because the dates didn't fit? Science is conservative by design, and this is often good. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and we should not overturn established models lightly. But conservatism can also become dogma, and when multiple lines of evidence from multiple sites using multiple methods all point toward greater antiquity, at what point do we stop calling them anomalies and start calling them data? At Serra de Capivara, the excavators have now spent decades documenting their findings, publishing in peer-reviewed journals, hosting international conferences, inviting critics to examine the stratigraphy and the dating methods. The evidence has not been refuted so much as it has been ignored, set aside, treated as problematic rather than potentially revolutionary. Why? Perhaps because accepting it would require rewriting not just a timeline but an entire conceptual framework. It would require acknowledging that human history is messier, less linear, more punctuated by extinctions and isolations and lost chapters than the progressive narrative we prefer. It would mean accepting that people reached South America, established themselves perhaps multiple times over vast spans of time, and then possibly went extinct or dwindled to such small numbers that they left almost no trace, only for new waves to arrive later, unaware of those who had come before, starting again, building again, inscribing again on a palimpsest whose earlier writings we can barely read. This is not a comfortable story. It is a story of failure and forgetting as much as achievement. It is a story that reminds us that presence does not guarantee continuity, that arrival does not ensure survival, that we are more fragile across deep time than we like to admit. But it is also a story of astonishing resilience, of humans attempting the improbable again and again, crossing vast distances with tools and knowledge we can scarcely imagine, adapting to environments from the Arctic to the tropics, from deserts to rainforests, always pushing outward, always testing the limits of where we can go and how we can live. If there were people in South America 80,000 years ago, they were not Clovis people. They were not even the ancestors of Clovis people because the genetics don't support that level of continuity. They were something else, a branch that perhaps ended, a lineage that faded, leaving only the stones they worked and the ochre they ground and the charcoal they left in hearths that have since turned to layers in the earth. Or perhaps they did contribute, in ways too subtle for our current methods to detect, ghost populations whose genes survive in fractions of a percent in living people, diluted by later arrivals, masked by the dominant signal of more recent migrations, but they're nonetheless a whisper of deep antiquity in the double helix. We don't know. That is the honest answer. We don't know, and the uncertainty is part of what makes this compelling. What we do know is that the timelines keep getting pushed back. Every decade, it seems, brings new evidence that people were in the Americas earlier than we thought. First, it was Clovis at 13,000 years. Then pre-Clovis sites started being accepted, 14,000, 15,000. Now we have White Sands at 23,000, and Monteverde's lower levels suggesting even more. The direction of discovery is consistent, always older, always more complex. Where does it end? Or does it end at all? Consider the cave art again, because there is something important there beyond just the dating controversies. The art at Serra de Capivara and other South American rock shelters includes handprints, geometric patterns, animal figures, hunting scenes, and abstract symbols that recur across vast distances. Some of these motifs are also found in rock art traditions in Africa, in Europe, in Australia, similarities that seem too specific to be entirely coincidental. Yes, humans everywhere have similar cognitive capacities and might independently create similar symbols. Yes, certain geometric patterns may emerge from universal features of human neurology, phosphenes seen in altered states, structures inherent to visual processing. But when you see the same rare, specific configurations of lines and dots appearing in caves separated by oceans and tens of thousands of years, you start to wonder. Are these memories? Are they cultural information transmitted across unimaginable spans of time and distance, carried by populations we've lost track of, preserved in the deeply conservative medium of ritual and symbol long after the material culture that accompanied them has vanished? Or are they evidence of contact, of meetings between groups we assume were isolated, of knowledge exchange across the ancient world through networks we have not yet mapped? The latter seems impossible given our current models, but the former seems almost more mysterious, because it suggests that certain symbolic languages are so fundamental, so deeply rooted in what it means to be human, that they arise again and again or persist across every barrier we imagine could erase them. In the Amazon basin, there are earthworks, massive geometric structures, ditches and mounds forming squares and circles hundreds of meters across. For years, they were hidden under rainforest canopy, but as deforestation has cleared areas, LiDAR surveys have revealed them by the hundreds. Some date to just a few thousand years ago, but others may be older, and they indicate sophisticated societies with the organization and labor to move immense amounts of earth. We are only beginning to understand the cultural complexity of ancient Amazonia, to move past the idea that the rainforest was an untouched wilderness and recognize it as a landscape shaped by human hands for millennia. The terra preta, the enriched black soils found throughout the Amazon, are not natural but anthropogenic, created by intensive occupation and agricultural practices that transformed the soil chemistry itself. If the Amazon has been managed and modified by humans for far longer and far more extensively than we realized, if complex societies rose and fell there leaving traces we're only now learning to see, then how many other assumptions about the past are built on absences of evidence rather than evidence of absence? How many times have we looked at a landscape and called it pristine, natural, untouched, when in fact it was a garden, a managed ecosystem, shaped by people who understood it in ways we've forgotten? And if that is true of the Amazon now, what was true of it 10,000 years ago, or 30,000 or 80,000? What stories are written in the soil that we don't yet know how to read? The DNA studies continue to refine, bringing more ancient individuals into the analysis, sampling more diverse contemporary populations, applying more sophisticated computational models. Each year, the picture gains resolution but also complexity. Where once we spoke of a single migration, we now talk of pulses, of back migrations, of localized extinctions and replacements. We talk of the Beringian standstill, a hypothesis that the founding population of the Americas spent several thousand years isolated on the Bering Land Bridge, adapting to harsh conditions, before the ice corridor opened and they could move south. This explains certain genetic signatures, certain patterns of diversity. But if there was a standstill population waiting to move south, could there not also have been earlier groups that found other routes, coastal routes, or even more ancient crossings during earlier interglacial periods when sea levels and ice configurations were different? The Earth's climate over the past 100,000 years has not been stable. There have been swings, warm periods and cold, times when the sea was lower and land bridges existed, times when the ice retreated and passages opened. The last glacial maximum was just one episode in a long, complex story of environmental change. If we imagine human movement as responsive to climate, as opportunistic, then we should expect not one migration event but many attempts, some successful, some not, across the full span of time that modern humans have existed. And modern humans have existed for at least 300,000 years, possibly longer depending on how we define the boundaries of our species. For most of that time we were in Africa, but by 100,000 years ago we were beginning to appear in the Middle East, and by 70 or 80,000 years ago we were in Southeast Asia and approaching Australia. So where is the impossibility in humans reaching the Americas 80,000 years ago? Not via Beringia, perhaps, because the conditions were not right, the ice and sea levels did not align. But via some other route, some coastal journey, some accidental voyage carried by storm currents across the Pacific? The Pacific is vast, yes, but humans have crossed vaster conceptual distances with less. We have crossed deserts that should have killed us, mountains that should have stopped us, adapted to climates from below freezing to above boiling, eaten foods that required elaborate processing to become non-toxic, and survived in nearly every terrestrial environment on the planet. We are, as a species, relentlessly expansive, curious to the point of recklessness, willing to try the untried and go where we have not gone. Why would the Americas have been different? Why would they have remained empty, waiting, for all those tens of thousands of years until finally, at the very last moment before the Ice Age ended, we arrived? It makes more sense, doesn't it, to imagine that we tried earlier, that some of those attempts succeeded at least temporarily, and that the story we tell now is just the final, most successful, most documented chapter in a much longer book. There are researchers now who speak openly about multiple waves of settlement, about the possibility of pre-sapiens hominins even reaching the Americas, carried by the same forces of climate and chance that moved Homo erectus across Asia. This is more speculative, less supported by clear evidence, but the question is worth asking. If Denisovans made it to Southeast Asia and Melanesia, if Neanderthals ranged across Europe and into Siberia, if Homo floresiensis survived on an Indonesian island until just 50,000 years ago, then the world in deep time was more populated with different kinds of humans than we often remember. And some of those humans had seafaring capabilities, had the ability to reach isolated places. Is it completely impossible that some hominin, whether Homo sapiens or another species, reached the Americas before the dates we currently accept? Impossible is a strong word. Unlikely, unsupported by current evidence, highly speculative, yes. but impossible? The absence of fossils is not proof of absence, especially in regions where preservation is poor and survey coverage is incomplete. The Americas are vast, and we have excavated such a tiny fraction of their landscapes. Every year, new sites are found, new dates are published, new models are proposed. The field is moving, the consensus is shifting, and what seemed certain a generation ago is now questioned. This is how science should work, revising in the face of new data, but it also means that our current models, however confident we are in them, are likely not the final word. So let us imagine, just for the space of this thought, that the deep dates from Serra de Capivara are correct or even half correct. Let us imagine that people were in South America 50,000 years ago, or 60 or 80. Who were they? They would have been anatomically modern, because Homo sapiens is the only species with confirmed presence in the regions from which such a migration could plausibly have originated. They would have had language, almost certainly, because language appears to be very ancient in our lineage, present long before the Upper Paleolithic. They would have had tools, knowledge of fire, clothing made from skins or plant fibers, an understanding of how to find food and water in unfamiliar landscapes. They would have been us in every biological sense, but culturally, they would have been profoundly different because they would have lived before the explosion of symbolic culture that marks the Upper Paleolithic, before the proliferation of art and ornament and elaborate burial that we associate with fully modern behavior. Or perhaps not. Perhaps they had all of those things, and we just haven't found the evidence or haven't recognized it. Cultural evolution does not proceed at the same pace everywhere. Some populations develop certain technologies or practices early, others later, and isolation can preserve archaic lifeways for millennia. If a group reached South America in deep time and then became isolated, cut off from subsequent innovations occurring in Africa or Eurasia, they might have continued with a toolkit and culture that looked, to our eyes, more archaic than their biology warranted. Or they might have innovated independently, creating unique traditions that we would not recognize because they don't fit our typologies, our expectations shaped by European and African sequences. Imagine them moving through a landscape that was different in almost every respect from what we see today. The climate was different, colder during glacial periods, wetter or drier in different regions. The megafauna were still abundant, giant ground sloths and glyptodonts, saber-toothed cats and massive bears, creatures that have no modern analogs. The plant communities were configured differently, species that are now separated by climate zones grew together, and the rivers ran in different channels, and the coastlines were miles away from where they are now because the sea was lower, ice holding the ocean's water locked away in continental glaciers. They would have walked along beaches that are now drowned, hunted in valleys that are now underwater or buried, slept in caves whose mouths have collapsed or been filled with sediment. The world they knew is almost entirely inaccessible to us, written over by time and geology. And if they had children, and those children had children, a lineage extending across thousands of years, where did it go? Did it persist in isolation until later waves arrived and absorbed it, genes blending, cultures meeting and merging in ways we can no longer distinguish? Or did it end, populations dwindling in the face of climate shifts or disease or simple bad luck, the kind of demographic stochasticity that can doom small groups cut off from others? Extinction is the norm in the fossil record, not the exception. Most lineages end. Most experiments in living fail eventually. But failure across deep time does not mean those lives did not matter, that those journeys were not real, that the footprints they left in ancient mud are any less significant because no one descended from them survived to remember. We are haunted by these ghosts, these possible people, because they remind us that our presence here is not inevitable, that the continuity we feel with the past is fragile, that entire chapters of human story can be lost so completely that we argue about whether they ever existed. And yet they call to us from the stones, from the deep layers, from the statistical anomalies in genetic data. They ask us to consider that history is not a single thread but a braided rope, strands joining and splitting, some running the full length and others ending abruptly, all woven together into a pattern we can perceive only dimly, from a distance, with the knowledge that we are missing most of the fibers. Look at the cultural similarities that span the Pacific, the use of certain plant medicines, the construction of similar watercraft, the presence of shared mythological motifs. Some of this has been traced to relatively recent contact, Polynesian voyages in the past 2,000 years. But some patterns seem older, harder to explain through documented contact. The presence of sweet potato in Polynesia before European contact is now understood to indicate South American interaction. But when did that exchange begin? Was it a single event, or multiple exchanges over time? And are there other exchanges, other contacts, that left traces too subtle or too degraded for us to identify with certainty? The ocean currents of the Pacific flow in gyres, great circular patterns that could carry a disabled vessel or a raft across thousands of miles. Accidental voyages are documented historically. Fishermen swept out to sea and deposited on distant shores months later, sometimes alive, sometimes not. Over tens of thousands of years, how many such accidents might have occurred? How many times might a small group from Asia or Polynesia or even South America itself, blown off course or intentionally voyaging, have landed on a shore far from home and tried to make a life there? Most such events would leave no trace. A handful of people arriving with no way to return, perhaps surviving a generation or two before disease or accident or violence ended them. But some might have succeeded, might have met existing populations and joined them or found an empty niche and filled it, contributing genetic and cultural material that would be diluted over time but never entirely erased. This is the model of human history that genetics increasingly supports, not pure replacement or pure continuity, but a messy, ongoing process of mixture, of small populations absorbing newcomers, of genes and ideas flowing across porous boundaries. If that is true for the past 10,000 years, the period we have the best documentation for, why would it not be true for earlier periods as well? The deep human story is one of meetings, of populations splitting and coming back together, of isolation and reunion, of genetic exchange and cultural diffusion occurring whenever and wherever groups came into contact. And the Americas, far from being isolated, may have been part of that network, however tenuously, however sporadically, for far longer than we've acknowledged. What does it mean for our sense of ourselves? For indigenous peoples of the Americas whose histories and origin narratives are often dismissed or overwritten by scientific accounts. This is a delicate question, one that sits at the intersection of archaeology, genetics, identity, and politics. Many Native American communities have oral traditions that speak of deep presence in their homelands, of origins here rather than migrations from elsewhere. For a long time, these narratives were simply rejected by science, which insisted on Bering Strait crossings and relatively recent arrival. But if the dates keep getting pushed back, if the evidence for earlier and earlier human presence accumulates, do the scientific and traditional narratives begin to converge? If people have been in the Americas for 20,000 years or 30 or more, at what point does migration from elsewhere become origin here in any meaningful sense? A people who have been in a place for 1,000 generations are not immigrants. They are indigenous, autochthonous of the land itself. The distinction between arriving 20,000 years ago and having always been here dissolves into irrelevance across that span of time. And if there were multiple arrivals, multiple populations, then the story is not one of a single founding event but a complex history of different groups coming at different times, sometimes replacing, sometimes mixing, sometimes coexisting. This is uncomfortable for narratives that rely on purity or singular origin, but it is more honest to the complexity of human history, which is always and everywhere about movement, mixture, and change. The question of who was first becomes less important than the question of who was here, and when, and what happened between them. At White Sands, the footprints include those of children, teenagers, small feet stepping in the tracks of larger ones, a moment of family or community activity frozen in time. They are dated to the middle of the last glacial maximum, a period of immense cold and environmental stress. And yet here they are, people living, traveling, existing in a landscape we've often imagined as too harsh for human presence. What does it say about their resilience, their adaptability, that they were here, thriving well enough to have children, to move across the land with apparent purpose? These were not desperate refugees clinging to survival. These were people who knew their environment, who had the skills and knowledge to live in it successfully. The footprints are not tentative or stumbling. They are confident, purposeful, the tracks of people who belonged where they were. And if they were there then, who were their ancestors and how far back does that lineage extend? Every answer we find generates new questions, deeper layers of mystery. This is the nature of exploring deep time, of trying to reconstruct events from fragments, from absences, from the few durable things that survive the endless erosion of millennia. We will never know the full story. Too much is lost. Too much depends on preservation conditions we cannot control and luck we cannot replicate. But we can. No more than we do now, and the direction of knowledge is toward greater antiquity, greater complexity, more arrivals, more diversity. The picture will continue to change, the timelines will continue to be revised, and the story of the first Americans will continue to expand backward in time, each generation of archaeologists and geneticists finding earlier evidence, pushing the horizons of the possible. And somewhere, in layers we haven't yet excavated, in sediments now underwater or buried under cities or simply in places we haven't thought to look, there are tools, bones, footprints, charcoal, the durable remnants of lives lived so long ago that they feel more like myth than history. But they are not myth. They are history, our history, the deep roots of the human presence on this continent, roots that extend further than we've been willing to see. What if humans reached South America 80,000 years earlier than we thought? What if they reached it multiple times, in multiple waves, some leaving traces and some leaving none, some persisting and some vanishing, all contributing to the palimpsest of presence that we are only now beginning to read? Then the story of humanity is even more astonishing than we believed, more marked by ambition and adaptation, by failure and resilience, by journeys across impossible distances and survival in unlikely places. Then we are the inheritors not of a single migration, a single founding event, but of countless attempts, countless brave or desperate groups striking out into the unknown, most forgotten, a few remembered, all part of the great human dispersal that carried our species to every corner of the earth. The implications ripple outward into other questions, other disciplines. If humans were in the Americas earlier, did they contribute to the extinction of the megafauna? The standard story is that the arrival of Clovis hunters coincided with rapid extinctions of mammoths, mastodons, ground sloths, and many other large mammals around 13,000 years ago. But if humans were present earlier, in smaller numbers, for longer periods, then the extinction story becomes more complex. Perhaps it was not a sudden hunting blitz but a longer process, populations of animals and humans coexisting for millennia before climate change at the end of the Ice Age tipped the balance. Or perhaps the earlier human populations were too small, too dispersed, to have significant impact, and the extinctions really were driven by the larger, more widespread populations that arrived later. Or perhaps there were multiple extinction pulses, earlier ones coinciding with earlier human arrivals, and we've conflated them into a single event because our chronological resolution is not fine enough to distinguish them. The questions multiply, branching like dendrites, each answer revealing new uncertainties. Consider the linguistic evidence, another line of inquiry that has traditionally supported relatively recent peopling of the Americas. The indigenous languages of the Americas are staggeringly diverse, hundreds of distinct language families with no clear relationships to languages in the Old World. This diversity has been interpreted as indicating deep time for languages to diverge, but also as indicating multiple founding populations speaking different languages, or rapid diversification in isolation. Some linguists have proposed deep connections, hypothetical macrofamilies linking American languages to each other and to Siberian or even circumpolar languages, but these proposals remain controversial, criticized for relying on surface similarities that may be coincidental. If we had better methods for linguistic reconstruction, if we could trace language change with the precision we can trace genetic change, what would the languages tell us about the peopling of the Americas? Would they support a single migration or multiple? Would they show evidence of earlier substrates, languages spoken by pre-existing populations and influencing later arrivals? We don't know because language does not fossilize and reconstruction beyond a certain time depth becomes speculative, patterns dissolving into noise. But the diversity is there, undeniable, and it speaks to long presence, to populations separating and evolving in isolation, to the passage of enough time for mutual intelligibility to be lost entirely. And if that process takes thousands of years, tens of thousands, then the linguistic diversity we see is consistent with early arrival, with deep roots in the continents. The archaeological evidence continues to accumulate, each excavation season bringing new sites, new dates, new materials into the record. In Mexico, in Central America, throughout South America, researchers are finding evidence that pushes back the timeline, that adds complexity to the story. Chiqui White Cave in Mexico has produced dates as old as 30,000 years from a high-altitude site where stone tools were found in stratified deposits. The dates and associations are debated, but the site adds to the growing body of evidence for pre-Clovis presence. In Uruguay, in Argentina, in Peru, there are sites with dates in the 15 to 20,000 year range, each adding a data point to the map of early human presence. And the dating methods continue to improve, new techniques allowing us to date materials we couldn't date before, to refine chronologies, to cross-check results using multiple independent methods. Optically stimulated luminescence dating, which measures when sediment grains were last exposed to light, can date layers that contain no organic material for radiocarbon dating. Uranium series dating can date calcite formations in caves, bracketing the age of artifacts or bones found in association. Each method has strengths and limitations, and each can be questioned, but when multiple methods applied to the same context yield similar results, confidence increases. The scientific process is one of provisional conclusions, always open to revision, but also cumulative, building toward better approximations of truth. And the cumulative weight of evidence now supports human presence in the Americas earlier than Clovis, earlier than 15,000 years, and possibly, in some locations, much earlier still. The question is no longer whether there were pre-Clovis people, but how many waves there were when they arrived, where they came from, and what happened to them. Did they persist and become the ancestors of all later Native Americans? Or did some groups go extinct and get replaced by later arrivals? The genetics suggest mostly continuity from a single source population that diverged from East Asians, but with enough anomalies and outliers to keep the question open. Perhaps the earliest arrivals were small in number and contributed only marginally to the genetic makeup of later populations, their presence detectable only in the faint statistical traces we're just learning to identify. Or perhaps our methods are still too crude, our sampling too limited, to see the full picture, and future studies with more ancient DNA and more sophisticated analysis will reveal a more complex story. What we can say with confidence is that the narrative is changing, that the old certainties have given way to productive uncertainty, and that this uncertainty is not a failure of science but a sign of its vitality, its willingness to question and revise in the face of new evidence. And what does this mean for you, listening now, wherever you are in the world? What does it mean that the story of human arrival in the Americas is more ancient, more complex, more mysterious than we've been told? Perhaps it means that history is always deeper than we imagine, that the roots of our presence in any place extend further into time than our records can follow. Perhaps it means that we should hold our narratives lightly, knowing they are constructions built from fragmentary evidence, subject to revision as new fragments come to light. Perhaps it means that we are all migrants, all descendants of people who moved, who crossed boundaries and adapted to new places, who carried with them the knowledge and genes and stories of where they came from and mixed them with what they found in the places they arrived. There are no pure lineages, no unmixed populations, no origins that don't trace back eventually to somewhere else. But there are deep roots, places where people have lived for so long that they and the land have shaped each other, become part of each other's story. And if those roots go back 20,000 years or 50 or 80, then they are as deep as roots can be in the context of modern human existence, deep enough that origin and arrival blur into each other, deep enough that the distinction ceases to have meaning. We are left, as always in these explorations, with more questions than answers, with a sense of the vastness of time and the fragility of evidence, with humility before the complexity of the past. But we are also left with wonder, with the astonishing fact that people, humans like us in every essential way, crossed oceans and continents, endured ice ages and climate swings, adapted to environments from tropical forests to Arctic tundra, and left their marks, however faint, in stone and bone and earth. They were here. That is not in doubt. The question is when and how many times and what their stories were, stories we will never fully recover but can glimpse in fragments, in the scattered evidence they left behind. In the rock shelters of Brazil, the paintings still glow in certain light, ochre and charcoal images of hands and animals and symbols whose meanings we can only guess. Some were made recently in historical times and we know their makers. Others were made thousands of years ago, by people whose descendants may still live in the region or may be gone entirely. And some, if the dates are correct, were made tens of thousands of years ago, by people who walked out of deep time and left this record, this testimony of their existence, these handprints pressed into stone saying, I was here, I saw this, I marked this place. What did they see when they looked out from those shelters? A landscape utterly different from today's, populated by animals that no longer exist, shaped by climate patterns that have shifted. What did they know? What stories did they tell about where they came from, about the journeys that brought them here, about the world as they understood it? We will never hear their voices, never know their names, never read their thoughts. But we can stand where they stood, touch the walls they touched, see the marks they made, and recognize in them the fundamental human impulse to make meaning, to create, to leave a trace. This is what connects us across the abyss of time, not genetics or language or culture, all of which change, but the simple fact of consciousness, of being aware and wanting that awareness to matter, to be recorded, to persist. Every cave painting is a declaration against oblivion, a refusal to be forgotten. And here we are, tens of thousands of years later, finding them, deciphering them, telling their stories as best we can. We have become the memory they hoped for, the witnesses to their existence. In that sense, they have succeeded. They have defeated time, or at least cheated it, their marks outlasting their bodies, their cultures, their languages, everything but the images themselves and the human capacity to recognize them as kin. We look at those handprints and we know instantly what they are. We don't need translation or explanation. A hand is a hand, and the act of pressing it to a wall and blowing pigment around it to leave a negative image is transparent in its meaning. I am here, this is my mark, remember me. And we do remember, even though we don't know who they were, even though we can't speak their names. We remember that they existed, that they were human, that they mattered. This is what the deep past offers us, not certainty or complete knowledge, but connection, a sense of continuity with those who came before, a recognition that we are part of a story much larger and longer than our individual lives or even our civilizations. The story of humans in South America may go back 80,000 years, or it may not. The evidence is fragmentary, contested, insufficient to compel consensus. But it is sufficient to make us wonder, to question, to keep looking. And the act of looking, of asking these questions, of pushing the boundaries of what we know, is itself valuable. It expands our sense of the possible, challenges our assumptions, reminds us that the past is not a fixed, known thing but a frontier, a space we explore with the tools of science and the imagination of storytellers. We are, all of us, engaged in the same project, trying to understand where we come from, how we got here, what our presence on this planet means. And the deeper we look, the more complex the answers become, but also the more wondrous, because complexity is the signature of life, of evolution, of history. Simple stories are satisfying, but they are rarely true. The truth is messy, full of contradictions and exceptions, events that don't fit the pattern, evidence that points in multiple directions. But that messiness is also richness, texture, the detail that makes a story real rather than a myth. The myth of the first Americans was simple and clean, a single migration, a defined moment of arrival, a clear beginning. The reality appears to be multiple migrations, uncertain timings, different groups arriving at different times from different places, some succeeding and some failing, some leaving descendants and some disappearing, all weaving together into a complex tapestry that we are only beginning to see the full shape of. And that is a better story, more true to the human experience, which is always about movement, mixture, adaptation, survival. We are not a species that stays put. We are not a species that accepts boundaries. We push, we explore, we try, we fail, we try again, and eventually we get everywhere, to every environment that can support human life and even some that barely can. This is our nature, our gift and our curse, this restless drive to see what's over the next hill, across the next river, beyond the next ocean. It has carried us to every continent, to the highest mountains and the deepest valleys, to islands no one should have been able to reach and deserts no one should have been able to cross. And it carried some of us, long ago, to the Americas, perhaps many times, in many ways, until finally we arrived in numbers large enough and with technologies effective enough to establish permanent presence, to fill the continents, to become indigenous. How many attempts preceded that success? How many small groups landed on these shores, looked around at the unfamiliar landscape, and tried to make a life only to fade away, leaving nothing but a few stones and bones and charcoal layers for us to find, if we're lucky, tens of thousands of years later. We don't know, and we may never know, but the possibility is there, written in the anomalous dates, the disputed footprints, the genetic outliers, the cultural similarities that span oceans. The possibility that the human story in the Americas is far older than we've been taught, that it includes chapters we've forgotten or never knew, that the people we call the first Americans were not first at all, but the latest in a long series of arrivals. And if that is true, what does it change? Does it matter, practically, to our lives now, to know that people were here 80,000 years ago instead of 15,000? In one sense, no. The distant past is distant. It does not pay our bills or solve our immediate problems. It is an abstraction, a story we tell about time before living memory. But in another sense, yes, it matters profoundly because it shapes how we understand ourselves, our place in time, our relationship to the land and to each other. If we are the descendants of people who journeyed for tens of thousands of years, who adapted to every environment, who survived ice ages and climate catastrophes, who lost entire populations and still persisted, then we carry that resilience in us, that capacity to endure and adapt. And if the Americas have been home to humans for far longer than we thought, then the indigenous peoples who were here when Europeans arrived are not recent arrivals but the bearers of a presence that stretches back into the deepest time, roots that reach into ages we can barely imagine. This challenges the colonial narratives that dismissed Native Americans as primitive or recent, that justified displacement and genocide by claiming the land was not really theirs, that they had not been here long enough to have true claim. If they had been here for 20,000 years, for 50, for 80, then that argument collapses entirely. They are as indigenous as it is possible to be, their connection to the land measured in millennia that dwarf the few centuries of European presence. So yes, it matters. History matters. Deep time matters. Not because it changes what we should do, we should treat people with dignity and respect their rights regardless of how long they've been somewhere, but because it reveals the stories we've told to justify our actions, the ways we've used timelines and narratives to serve political ends. And when those timelines shift, when the evidence forces us to revise our stories, we are given the opportunity to revise our understanding, to see the past more clearly, and perhaps to build a more honest relationship with it. The past is not just about the past. It is also about the present, about who we are now, about the identities we construct and the connections we claim. And the deep past, the time beyond memory or record, is especially powerful because it is mysterious, open to interpretation, a space where myth and evidence intertwine. We will never have certainty about events 80,000 years ago. The evidence is too sparse, too ambiguous, too vulnerable to alternative explanations. But we can have increasingly well-informed speculation, hypotheses built on the best data available, subject to testing and revision as new data emerge. This is the scientific method applied to deep time, and it is messy and slow and often frustrating, but it is the best tool we have for approaching truth about the distant past. Better than myth because it demands evidence. Better than dogma because it embraces uncertainty and revision. Better than silence because it keeps asking questions, keeps looking, keeps trying to recover the stories that time has tried to erase. In the end, the question of whether humans reached South America 80,000 years earlier than we thought is not just a factual question about dates and migrations. It is a philosophical question about how we know what we know, about how we construct narratives from fragments, about how we balance skepticism and openness, caution and imagination. It is a question about what we are willing to believe, what evidence we require, and how much uncertainty we can tolerate. And it is a question that reflects back on us, on our own moment in time, reminding us that future archaeologists and geneticists and historians will look back at our era and find it just as fragmentary, just as puzzling, just as open to interpretation as we find the deep past. They will have some of our records, some of our artifacts, some of our DNA, but they will not have the full story, the lived experience, the subjective reality of what it meant to be alive now. They will construct narratives about us, and some of those narratives will be wrong, based on misunderstandings or incomplete evidence or biases they don't recognize. And they will revise those narratives as they find new evidence, and the story of our time will shift and change just as the story of deep time is shifting now. This is the human condition, to know imperfectly, to understand partially, to be always in the process of revising our knowledge, never arriving at final truth but always moving toward better approximations of it. And in that movement, in that ongoing conversation, between evidence and interpretation, between data and narrative, we find meaning, purpose, a sense of participating in something larger than ourselves. We are the rememberers, the ones who look back, who ask what happened, who try to recover the lost, who give voice to the silent stones and bones. And in doing so, we become part of the story ourselves, another layer in the palimpsest, another set of footprints in the long human journey through time. Somewhere in South America, in soil that has not yet been excavated, there may be tools, bones, charcoal, evidence of human presence older than any we've yet found. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the anomalous dates are errors, contamination, misinterpretation, and the story really does begin 15 or 20,000 years ago, no earlier. But the search continues, the questions remain open, and the possibility hangs in the air like the scent of rain before a storm, promising revelation, transformation, a fundamental shift in how we understand the human past. What if humans reached South America 80,000 years earlier? What if they tried and failed and tried again, wave after wave across unimaginable spans of time, until finally one wave succeeded and gave rise to the populations that Europeans encountered, populations that had already been here longer than any written history, longer than any civilization, longer than any monument or city or empire? Then we are looking at a story not of arrival but of persistence, not of conquest of an empty land but of adaptation across climatic epochs, not of a beginning but of a continuity that stretches back beyond our ability to measure it accurately. And we are reminded that the Earth is old, far older than us, and that human time, even deep human time, is a thin layer on top of geological time, a brief moment in the planet's long history. But within that brief moment, we have done astonishing things, spread across the globe, adapted to nearly every environment, developed languages and cultures and technologies of staggering diversity and complexity. And if part of that story includes journeys to South America 80,000 years ago, journeys that left only the faintest traces, populations that rose and fell leaving barely a whisper in the archaeological record, then that makes our story not less significant but more so, because it speaks to the tenacity of human curiosity, the power of human mobility, the refusal to accept limits. We go where we are not supposed to go. We survive what should kill us. We ask questions that have no easy answers. And we keep searching, keep digging, keep analyzing, because the not knowing is unbearable to us. The mystery is a challenge we cannot refuse. This is what it means to be human, to be aware of time, to wonder about the past, to seek our origins, to construct narratives that make sense of the fragments. And the more we learn, the more complex those narratives become, but also the more wondrous, because complexity reveals depth, texture, the intricate interweaving of cause and effect, adaptation and environment, chance and necessity. The story of the peopling of the Americas is one of the great narratives of human prehistory, and it is still being written, still unfolding as new evidence comes to light. We do not yet know the full shape of it, the complete timeline, the all migrations and movements and mixtures that produced the indigenous peoples who were here when the historical record begins. But we know more than we did, and we will know more in the future, and each piece of new knowledge shifts the picture, adds detail, corrects error, opens new questions. This is the process, the great collective project of understanding our past, a project that involves thousands of researchers across multiple disciplines, working in different places on different problems, all contributing to a shared pool of knowledge. No one person has the full picture. No one study provides definitive answers. But together, cumulatively, the field advances and our understanding deepens. And we, as inheritors of this knowledge, as listeners and readers and seekers, participate in that project simply by paying attention, by caring about these questions, by allowing ourselves to wonder and to question and to revise our understanding when new evidence warrants it. So where are you right now as you listen to this? What time is it where you are, and what does this ancient story mean to you in your life, in your moment? Perhaps you are listening to fall asleep, letting the slow cadence of these ideas wash over you, the deep time and distant events creating a space where your own thoughts can slow, where the immediate can recede and the vast can expand. Perhaps you are listening to learn, seeking information, wanting to understand the debates and evidence, the competing theories and uncertain conclusions. Perhaps you are listening because you are connected personally to this story, because your ancestors were among those who journeyed to the Americas, whose footprints are somewhere in the long chain that leads back into deep time. Wherever you are, whatever your connection, you are part of this now, part of the ongoing human conversation about where we come from and what it means. And the questions we've explored tonight remain open, unresolved, provocative. Were there people in South America 80,000 years ago? The evidence is tantalizing but insufficient. The dates are contested, the contexts are debated, the interpretations are multiple. But the possibility exists, and the search continues, and the story is richer for the uncertainty. For the sense that there is still so much to discover, still so many layers to excavate, still so many questions to ask. What would it mean if we found definitive proof? A site with clear stratigraphy, multiple dating methods all converging on ages of 60 or 80,000 years, artifacts and bones and DNA that unambiguously demonstrated human presence. It would mean rewriting textbooks, revising models, rethinking migration routes and timelines. It would mean acknowledging that our species is even more capable, even more mobile, even more adaptable than we've believed. It would mean that the human story in the Americas has roots deeper than any other continent except Africa, roots that reach back into the Middle Paleolithic, into time periods we associate with Neanderthals in Europe and Denisovans in Asia. And it would mean that we have to hold our narratives even more lightly, knowing that what we believe to be true is always provisional, always subject to the next discovery, the next excavation, the next analysis that changes everything. But even without definitive proof, the journey itself is valuable, the process of questioning and searching and debating, because it keeps us humble, keeps us curious, keeps us engaged with the deep past and its mysteries. We may never know for certain whether humans reached South America 80,000 years earlier than we thought. The evidence may remain forever ambiguous, the dates forever disputed, the story forever incomplete. But we can know that the question is worth asking, that the search is worth conducting, that the possibility alone expands our sense of what our ancestors were capable of and what our place in time really is. We are not the pinnacle of a linear progression. We are one moment in a long, complex, branching story that includes success and failure, presence and absence, memory and forgetting. And the more we learn about that story, the more we realize how much we don't know, how much has been lost, how much remains hidden in the earth, waiting for someone to find it, or already found and misunderstood, or destroyed before it could be found at all. This is the melancholy of deep time, the knowledge that most of the past is irrecoverable, that we are working with fragments, that the full story will never be known. But it is also the wonder of deep time, that even from fragments we can construct meaningful narratives, that even with incomplete knowledge we can glimpse the outlines of vast journeys and transformations, that the human capacity for curiosity and understanding can reach back across tens of thousands of years and touch, however lightly, the lives of those who came before. They are gone, those possible early South Americans, if they existed at all. Their bodies have returned to dust, their shelters have collapsed, their fires have gone cold, their languages have been silent for millennia beyond memory. But the stones remain, worked by hands that were as human as ours, shaped by minds that thought and planned and understood cause and effect. The bones remain, fragments that carry DNA, the molecular record of ancestry and adaptation. The footprints remain, pressed into ancient mud that turned to stone, preserving the exact moment of contact between human foot and earth. And we remain, their distant kin, the latest humans to walk this planet, asking about them, wondering, seeking. In that seeking, we honor them whether we find answers or not. We say that your existence mattered, that your journeys were significant, that the fact that you lived and struggled and perhaps died trying to make a home in a new land is worth remembering, worth investigating, worth preserving in whatever form we can. This is what history is, ultimately, not a collection of facts and dates but an act of remembrance, a refusal to let the past be entirely consumed by time, a reaching back across the abyss to say, you were here, we acknowledge you, we try to understand you, we keep your memory alive in the only way we can, through our questions and our research and our stories. And if the evidence ultimately shows that humans did reach South America 80,000 years earlier, then we will have recovered a lost chapter, brought back into the light a piece of human story that was almost erased. And if the evidence ultimately shows that they did not, that the anomalies have other explanations, that the deep dates are errors, then we will have learned something too, learned the limits of our methods, the ways evidence can mislead, the importance of skepticism and rigor. Either way, the search will have been worthwhile because the process of inquiry, the discipline of archaeology and genetics and historical reconstruction, is valuable in itself, teaching us how to think critically, how to weigh evidence, how to construct and test hypotheses, how to revise our beliefs when data demands it. These are skills, habits of mind, that serve us in every domain, not just in understanding the past but in navigating the present and imagining the future. And the questions we've explored tonight about early migrations and lost populations and the nature of evidence and narrative are fundamentally questions about epistemology, about how we know what we claim to know, about the relationship between data and interpretation. These are not just historical questions. They are philosophical questions, and they matter because how we answer them shapes how we understand knowledge itself, truth itself, reality itself. If the past is uncertain, if the story keeps changing, if evidence can be interpreted in multiple ways, then what does that say about certainty in general? About the narratives we construct about ourselves, our societies, our place in the world? It says that we should hold them lightly, provisionally, always ready to revise when new evidence or better arguments emerge. It says that certainty is often a mask for ignorance, and that acknowledging uncertainty is a sign of intellectual honesty, not weakness. It says that the world is complex, irreducibly so, and that simple stories are almost always incomplete, however comforting they may be. And it says that we should keep asking questions, keep seeking, keep being willing to be surprised, to have our assumptions challenged, to learn that what we believed was wrong. This is the scientific mindset, but it is also, or should be, the human mindset because we are a species defined by our curiosity, our ability to wonder and to question and to seek understanding. The deep past calls to that part of us, the part that wants to know where we came from, how we got here, what journeys our ancestors made and what challenges they overcame. And when we engage with those questions, we are not just learning about them. We are learning about ourselves, about what it means to be human, to be part of a lineage that stretches back hundreds of thousands of years, to carry in our bodies and minds the legacy of all those who came before. This is the gift of deep time, this connection across the ages, this sense of continuity and kinship with people we will never meet but who are, in the most fundamental sense, us, our family, our kin. We are all Africans if you go back far enough. We are all migrants, all descendants of those who left one place to try another. We all carry the genes and the heritage of people who crossed deserts and mountains and oceans, who adapted to ice and heat, who survived and reproduced and passed on their knowledge and their DNA. And some of those people perhaps crossed into South America 80,000 years ago or 60 or 50 and tried to make a life there, and perhaps succeeded for a time and perhaps failed, and perhaps their story is written in the stones of Serra de Capivara, in the deep layers that refuse to fit our timelines. Or perhaps not. Perhaps those dates are wrong, and the story is simpler, and the Americas were truly empty until the final pulse of migration in the late Pleistocene. But the uncertainty itself is beautiful, because it means there is still mystery, still unknown territory, still questions that matter and don't have easy answers. And as long as there are questions, there will be seekers, people drawn to the mystery, willing to spend careers excavating sites and analyzing data and debating interpretations, all in service of understanding a past that no one alive experienced. This is a peculiarly human endeavor, this fascination with our origins, this need to know where we came from even though it has no practical bearing on our survival now. But it has bearing on our meaning, on our sense of place and purpose, on how we understand the story we are part of. And so we keep searching, keep questioning, keep reaching back into deep time, knowing we will never recover it fully but unable to stop trying. Because we are the rememberers, and this is what we do. We remember, we record, we reconstruct, we pass on the stories, however fragmentary, however uncertain, because they are our stories, the stories of our species, and they deserve to be told. Imagine the first human to set foot in South America, whenever that was, 15,000 years ago or 80,000. Imagine stepping onto a shore after a journey of unimaginable distance, looking out at a landscape no human eye had seen before, or at least no eye from your lineage, your people. What did it feel like? Fear, wonder, exhaustion, relief? Did you know you were first, or did you simply know you had arrived, that you had survived the crossing, that you were here now and needed to find food, water, shelter? Did you look back across the ocean or the land bridge or whatever route you had traveled and think of those who had not made it, those lost to storms or starvation or predators along the way? Did you think of the place you had left, the people you would never see again, the familiar landscapes you had traded for this unknown territory? Or were you too focused on survival, on the immediate needs, on making fire and finding game and securing a place to sleep safely? We will never know what you thought or felt. We barely know that you existed. But if you did exist, if you were real, if you walked those shores and left your footprints and your tools and your genes somewhere in the earth or in the people who came after, then you deserve to be acknowledged, to be wondered about, to have your story sought even if it can never be fully recovered. You were brave or desperate or simply mobile, following resources, following the edge of the possible, doing what humans do, moving, adapting, surviving. And you were the beginning or one of many beginnings of the human presence in a land that would eventually be home to millions, to complex societies and diverse cultures, to civilizations that built cities and pyramids and empires. You could not have known what would come after you, what your arrival, your survival, your descendants would lead to. You were just living day to day, making the decisions that seemed right, that kept you alive, that allowed you to have children who would do the same. But you were part of something larger, a pattern, a process, the great human expansion across the planet, the restless movement that has defined our species since we first evolved. And whether you arrived 80,000 years ago or 15,000, whether you were the first or the latest in a series, whether your lineage persisted or faded, you were here, you were real, and you mattered. This is what we are reaching for when we excavate sites and date artifacts and sequence DNA, this connection to real people who lived real lives, however distant, however different from ours. We want to know them, to understand them, to feel that we are touching something true and human across the vastness of time. And when we find a footprint preserved in stone, when we hold a tool shaped by deliberate hands, when we sequence DNA from ancient bones and see the markers that connect them to living people, we feel that connection, that shock of recognition, that sense of touching the real. This is not abstract history. This is humanity, preserved in fragments, waiting to be found. And every fragment tells a story, or part of a story, and every story adds to the larger narrative of who we are and where we came from. The story of the peopling of the Americas is still being written, still being discovered, still being revised. We do not have the final version. We may never have the final version. But we have the process, the ongoing search, the accumulation of evidence, the refinement of methods, the debate and discussion and gradual convergence toward better understanding. And that is enough. It has to be enough because it is all we have, this slow, patient, collective effort to recover the past from the fragments that remain. So we keep digging, keep dating, keep analyzing, keep questioning. We find a stone tool in a layer that seems too old, and we ask, is the dating correct? Or is the context disturbed? Or is our timeline wrong? We find footprints in sediment dated to the middle of the Ice Age, and we ask, how did they get here? What route did they take? Who were they? We find DNA that doesn't quite fit the models, and we ask, is there a ghost population, an earlier migration, a mixture we haven't accounted for? And slowly, incrementally, we build a picture, incomplete but increasingly detailed, uncertain but increasingly informed. This is science at work, not producing certainty but producing better approximations, not answering all questions but answering some and identifying new ones to ask. And for those of us who care about these questions, who are drawn to the mysteries of deep time, this process is endlessly fascinating, endlessly rewarding. Because every answer leads to new questions, and every discovery reveals how much we still don't know, and the horizon of the unknown keeps receding as we move toward it. Always more to explore, always more to understand. The question of whether humans reached South America 80,000 years earlier is one question among many in the larger investigation of our origins and dispersals. It may be answered definitively someday, or it may remain forever in the realm of possibility, supported by some evidence but not conclusively proven. But either way, it has served its purpose, which is to make us think, to challenge our assumptions, to remind us that the past is not fixed and known but dynamic and open to reinterpretation. It has expanded our sense of the possible, suggested that our ancestors were more capable, more mobile, more adventurous than we've sometimes given them credit for. And it has connected us to them, these possible early South Americans, these shadows in deep time, these people who may have walked shores and climbed mountains and painted caves tens of thousands of years before the accepted timeline says anyone was here. Whether they were real or not, the fact that we can imagine them, the fact that we can look at the evidence and see the possibility, is itself meaningful. It means we are open to the past in all its complexity, willing to entertain alternative narratives, ready to revise our understanding when evidence warrants. And that openness, that willingness to question and revise, is essential to the scientific enterprise and to the broader human project of understanding ourselves and our place in the cosmos. We are small, ephemeral beings on a vast, ancient planet, and our time here is brief beyond measure when set against geological or cosmic timescales. But within that brief moment, we have managed to ask profound questions, to develop methods for answering them, to build a body of knowledge that connects us to our deepest past and extends our awareness across hundreds of thousands of years. This is astonishing when you think about it, that we can know anything at all about people who lived 80,000 years ago, that we can sequence their DNA, date their artifacts, map their migrations, tell their stories. We do this with tools they could never have imagined, technologies that seem like magic even to us when we pause to consider them, machines that read molecular clocks in bone, that measure the decay of isotopes in rock, that reconstruct ancient climates from ice cores and pollen grains. We have built a civilization capable of looking back across the abyss of time and seeing, however dimly, however incompletely, the lives of those who came before us. And we do it not for survival, not for immediate practical benefit, but because we are curious, because we want to know, because the question of where we came from and how we got here is fundamental to our sense of meaning. This is uniquely human, this deep time consciousness, this ability to conceive of and care about events that happened long before we were born and will have no direct impact on our lives. Other animals live in the present, perhaps with some short-term memory and some anticipation of the near future. But only humans, as far as we know, construct narratives that span millennia, that connect us to ancestors we never met, that make us part of a story that began long before us and will continue long after we are gone. And in constructing those narratives, we give meaning to our existence, we place ourselves in a larger context, we feel part of something enduring and significant. The story of early humans in South America, whether it goes back 15,000 years or 80,000, is part of that larger narrative, part of the story of our species and its journey across the planet. And by engaging with that story, by asking questions and seeking evidence and debating interpretations, we participate in the ongoing human project of self-understanding. We are not passive recipients of a fixed past. We are active investigators, reconstructing and revising, always trying to get closer to the truth, knowing we will never fully reach it but finding the attempt itself worthwhile. And so the question remains open, provocative, generative. What if humans reached South America 80,000 years earlier than we thought? What would that mean for our understanding of human migration, adaptation, survival? What would it mean for the indigenous peoples whose ancestors may include those earliest arrivals, whose presence in the land extends back into deep time? What would it mean for the nature of evidence, the limits of our methods, the uncertainty inherent in all attempts to reconstruct the distant past? These are not just academic questions. They touch on identity, on belonging, on how we understand our relationship to place and to time. And they remind us that history is not just about what happened, but about what we can know about what happened and how we know it and why we care. The footprints at White Sands are 23,000 years old, and they are unambiguous human footprints, undeniable. And they should not be there according to the models we had just a few years ago. But they are there, and so the models have to change and the story has to be revised, and we have to accept that what we believed was incomplete, that reality is more complex than our narratives had allowed. This is how science progresses, not smoothly but in fits and starts, with resistance and revision, with paradigms that hold until they can't, until the evidence becomes overwhelming and a new framework emerges. And we are living through one of those moments now, in the study of the peopling of the Americas, a time when the old certainties are giving way to new uncertainties, when the timeline is being pushed back, when the narrative is becoming more complex and more contested. This is uncomfortable for those who want clear answers, who need the past to be settled and known. But it is exhilarating for those who embrace uncertainty as opportunity, who see in every new discovery the potential for transformation, who understand that the best questions are the ones that don't have easy answers. And the question of early human presence in South America is one of those questions, one that will drive research for decades to come, that will inspire new excavations and new analyses and new debates. The sites are there, waiting to be found or to be re-examined with better methods. The bones are there, some already in museums, waiting for new technologies to extract DNA or isotopes that will tell us things we couldn't have learned before. The tools are there, buried in layers that may or may not be as old as they seem, waiting for dating methods to improve, for context to be better understood. And the people are still there, the descendants of whoever came first, or second, or 10th, carrying in their genes and their cultures and their oral traditions the echoes of journeys we are only beginning to reconstruct. They have always known they belonged here, that their roots go deep, that their presence is not a recent arrival but an ancient reality. And now, slowly, science is beginning to confirm what they have always said, that the indigenous peoples of the Americas have been here far longer than colonial narratives allowed, that their claims to the land are not recent or tenuous but ancient and deep. This is one of the most important implications of pushing back the timeline, of accepting earlier dates, of recognizing the complexity of the past. It shifts the moral and political landscape, challenges the narratives that were used to justify displacement and dispossession, affirms the legitimacy of indigenous claims and perspectives. And it reminds us that science is not neutral, that the questions we ask and the answers we accept have consequences beyond the academy, that history matters in the present, that the past is always political. So when we ask what if humans reached South America 80,000 years earlier, we are not just asking a technical question about dates and migrations. We are asking who belongs, who was here first, what claims are legitimate, what narratives have power. And the answer, increasingly, is that indigenous peoples belong, that they were here first by any meaningful measure, that their claims are legitimate, that their narratives deserve to be heard and respected. This is what the evidence is showing us, as the dates get pushed back, as the complexity is revealed, as the simple story of recent arrival gives way to the complex story of deep presence. And this is why the question matters, why the research continues, why we keep digging and dating and analyzing. Because we are not just recovering a lost past. We are shaping a more just future, one informed by better understanding, by honesty about what happened, by respect for those who were here long before us. The tools in Brazil that may be 50,000 or 80,000 years old are not just artifacts. They are testimonies, witnesses to presence, claims inscribed in stone that someone was here, that someone thought and planned and survived. And whether they are that old or not, whether the dates hold up or are revised, they have already done their work, which is to make us question, to challenge the accepted narrative, to insist that the past is not settled. They have opened space for conversation, for new research, for alternative possibilities. And in that space, indigenous voices can be heard, oral traditions can be taken seriously, different ways of knowing can be respected. This is not about replacing science with myth or evidence with belief. It is about recognizing that science itself is a cultural practice, shaped by assumptions and paradigms, and that other cultures have their own ways of understanding the past, their own forms of knowledge. And when multiple ways of knowing converge, when scientific evidence and oral tradition both point toward deep presence, toward ancient arrival, then we should pay attention, should take seriously the possibility that both are accessing aspects of a reality too complex for any single method to fully capture. The story of the peopling of the Americas is a story that belongs to everyone, to all humans, because it is part of the larger story of our species. But it belongs especially to the indigenous peoples of the Americas, whose ancestors lived it, whose genes and cultures carry its legacy, whose lands and lives were shaped by those deep migrations and adaptations. And they should have a voice in how that story is told, what evidence is considered, what interpretations are privileged. This is beginning to happen. Collaborations between archaeologists and indigenous communities, consultations about excavations and the treatment of remains, recognition that the past is not just data to be extracted but heritage to be respected. And these collaborations are producing better science, because indigenous knowledge often provides context and perspective that purely technical approaches miss, because local understanding of landscape and ecology and history can guide research in productive directions. So the question of early human presence in South America is also a question about who gets to tell the story, who gets to decide what counts as evidence, who gets to interpret the past. And the answer, increasingly, is that it should be a collaborative effort, scientists and indigenous peoples working together, each bringing their expertise and perspective, each respecting the other's ways of knowing. This is a more difficult process than science pursued in isolation, because it requires negotiation, compromise, mutual respect, patience with different epistemologies. But it is also a more human process, one that recognizes that the past belongs to those who are its living legacy, not just to those with the technical tools to study it. And it produces richer narratives, more nuanced understandings, stories that honor both the evidence and the lived experience, the data and the meaning. Imagine standing in Serra de Capivara now, in the rock shelters where the disputed evidence was found, looking at the paintings on the walls, the ochre hands and animal figures, thinking about the people who made them. Whether they were here 10,000 years ago or 50,000, they were here. They lived, they created, they left their marks. And we, standing here now, are connected to them across whatever span of time, by the simple fact of shared humanity, shared consciousness, shared impulse to make meaning and leave a trace. This is what the deep past offers us, this connection, this sense of kinship with those who came before, however distant, however different. And this is why we care, why we ask questions, why we seek evidence, why we tell stories. Because we are part of a continuity, a lineage, a story that extends back into deep time and forward into an unknown future. And understanding where we came from helps us understand who we are and where we might be going. The question of whether humans reached South America 80,000 years earlier will be answered, eventually one way or another, by evidence that is compelling enough to settle the debate. Or perhaps it will remain forever unresolved, a tantalizing possibility, supported by some data but never conclusively proven, a reminder of the limits of our knowledge and the persistence of mystery. Either outcome is acceptable because the value is not in the final answer but in the process of inquiry, the search itself, the questions that drive us to keep looking, keep questioning, keep trying to understand. And in the meantime, we have the evidence we have, the footprints at White Sands, the tools in Brazil, the genetic outliers, the painted shelters, all pieces of a puzzle we are still assembling. We have the debates, the competing interpretations, the disagreements about methods and contexts and implications, all signs of a living, dynamic field engaged with important questions. And we have the larger narrative, the story of human migration and adaptation, the astonishing journey of our species from African origins to every corner of the globe, a journey that is not yet complete, that continues in our own time as we move and mix and adapt to new environments. We are still migrants, still explorers, still pushing boundaries, still trying to go where we have not been. We have reached the depths of the oceans and the surface of the moon, and we dream of going further, to Mars and beyond, to places our ancestors could not have imagined. But even as we look forward, we also look back, seeking to understand the journeys that brought us here, the migrations and adaptations that made us what we are. And in looking back, we find not just facts and dates but meaning, connection, identity. We find our place in the long story of life on this planet, a story that began billions of years ago and will continue long after we are gone. But for now, we are here, conscious and curious, asking questions about the past and the future, constructing narratives that give shape to time, that make sense of change, that connect us to what came before and what will come after. This is the human gift, this capacity for narrative, for history, for deep time consciousness. And the story of early humans in South America, whether it begins 15,000 years ago or 80,000, is part of that larger gift, part of the ongoing human project of understanding ourselves and our place in time. So let the question remain open. Let the search continue. Let the evidence accumulate and the debates proceed and the narratives be revised as new data warrants. Let us embrace the uncertainty, the complexity, the mystery, because they are what make the inquiry worthwhile, what keep us engaged, what remind us that there is always more to learn, always deeper to go, always further back into time to reach. And let us remember that behind every artifact, every footprint, every piece of DNA, there were people, real people, who lived and struggled and survived and passed on their knowledge and their genes to the next generation. They are not abstract data points. They are our ancestors, our kin, the ones who made it possible for us to be here now, asking these questions, telling these stories. We owe them our existence, and we owe them our remembrance, however imperfect, however fragmentary. And so we keep their memory alive in the only way we can, by asking about them, by seeking evidence of their lives, by constructing narratives that honor their presence and their journeys. This is what history is, ultimately, an act of remembrance, a refusal to let the past be entirely forgotten. And the deep past, the time beyond writing and living memory, is the hardest to remember, the most vulnerable to being lost. But it is also the most important because it is where we come from, the deep roots of our existence, the foundation on which everything else is built. And if we let it be forgotten, if we stop asking questions, if we accept simple narratives and ignore contradictory evidence, then we lose part of ourselves, part of our story, part of what makes us human. So we keep asking, keep searching, keep remembering. We ask, what if humans reached South America 80,000 years earlier? And in asking, we keep alive the possibility, the mystery, the sense that there is still so much we don't know. We search for evidence, excavating sites, dating artifacts, sequencing DNA, applying every method and technology we have to the task of recovering the past. And we remember, telling stories, constructing narratives, connecting the fragments into patterns that make sense, that give meaning, that honor those who came before. This is our work, as historians and archaeologists and geneticists, as storytellers and seekers, as humans curious about our origins. And it is work that will never be finished, because the past is too vast, too complex, too fragmentary to ever be fully recovered. But that is not a reason to stop. It is a reason to continue, because every fragment recovered is precious. Every question answered is valuable. Every story told is an act of resistance against the forgetting that time imposes. And so we continue, generation after generation, each adding to the knowledge accumulated by those before, each refining the methods, each asking new questions, each finding new evidence. And the story grows richer, more complex, more nuanced, more true to the reality of what happened, even if we can never know that reality completely. This is the scientific enterprise, not a march toward final truth but an ongoing conversation with evidence, a process of approximation and revision, a collective effort that spans generations and disciplines and cultures. And it is beautiful in its way, this commitment to knowing, this refusal to be satisfied with ignorance or comfortable myths, this insistence on evidence and argument and openness to revision. It is one of the best things about being human, this capacity for inquiry, for building on the knowledge of those who came before, for reaching across time to understand those who lived long ago. And when we engage in it, when we ask about early humans in South America or any other deep historical question, we are participating in something larger than ourselves, contributing to a collective understanding that belongs to all humanity. So wherever you are right now, as this story comes to an end, know that you are part of this, part of the ongoing conversation about where we came from and who we are. Your curiosity, your attention, your willingness to engage with uncertainty and complexity, all of that matters. All of that contributes to the larger project of human self-understanding. And the question we've explored tonight, the question of whether humans reached South America 80,000 years earlier than we thought, is not just a question about the past. It is a question about how we know, how we revise our understanding, how we hold narratives and evidence in tension, how we respect both scientific rigor and indigenous knowledge, how we tell stories that honor the complexity of the real. And the answer, such as it is that we don't know for certain, not yet, maybe not ever. But we keep asking, keep searching, keep refining our methods and expanding our evidence base, and slowly, incrementally, the picture becomes clearer. We know more than we did a generation ago. We will know more a generation from now. And that is enough. That is the promise and the challenge of deep time inquiry, that it is never finished, always unfolding, always revealing new mysteries even as it solves old ones. The footprints at White Sands are real. The tools in Brazil are real. The genetic anomalies are real. The painted hands on cave walls are real. What they mean, how old they are, what story they tell, those are questions we are still working out. But they are there, waiting for us, testimony to presence, to lives lived, to journeys made, to the astonishing capacity of humans to adapt and survive and create meaning even in the harshest environments and the most distant times. And we, standing here now, looking back across the abyss of time, can feel the connection, can recognize in those ancient traces our own humanity reflected back to us, can know that we are part of a story that is far longer and far grander than any individual life or any single civilization. This is the gift of deep time, this perspective, this humility before the vastness of history, this sense of being part of something that extends beyond ourselves. And this is why we care about questions like whether humans reached South America 80,000 years earlier, because they connect us to that deep story, remind us of our place in it, give us a sense of continuity with all those who came before and all those who will come after. We are here for a moment, a brief flicker in the long night of time. But in that moment, we can ask profound questions, seek meaningful answers, tell stories that honor the past and illuminate the present and imagine the future. And in doing so, we become more than just ephemeral beings. We become the rememberers, the storytellers, the keepers of the long human story. This is our role, our purpose, our gift. And we honor it by asking, by searching, by remaining open to the mysteries that deep time offers, by refusing to settle for easy answers or comfortable narratives, by embracing the complexity and uncertainty that come with trying to understand a past that is mostly lost to us. So thank you for listening, for journeying with me into deep time, for engaging with these questions and possibilities, for being part of this ongoing human conversation. Wherever you are, whatever your connection to this story, you are part of it now. And the question remains open and provocative and generative, waiting for the evidence that will finally answer it, or waiting forever, a mystery that endures, a reminder that there is always more to know, always further to reach, always deeper into time to go. What if humans reached South America 80,000 years earlier? What if they did, and what if they didn't? Either way, the asking matters, the search matters, the story matters. And we continue, as we always have, seeking, remembering, telling, connecting across the abyss of time to those who came before and those who will come after, all of us part of the long, complex, beautiful story of being human. Sleep now, if you came here to sleep. Let these deep thoughts settle into your mind. Let the vastness of time and the mystery of origins wash over you. Let the questions dissolve into the quiet space where rest begins. And if you came here to learn, to question, to engage, then carry these ideas with you, turn them over in your mind, seek out the evidence, read the papers, follow the debates, form your own conclusions. Either way, know that you are part of this, part of the human story, part of the lineage that extends back into deep time and forward into an unknown future. You are the descendant of migrants, of survivors, of people who crossed impossible distances and adapted to impossible environments, who left traces in stone and bone and DNA that we are still finding, still interpreting, still trying to understand. And you are the ancestor of those who will come after, who will ask their own questions about the past, who will have methods and technologies we cannot imagine, who will know things about our time and earlier times that we can only guess at. You are the link between past and future, the living connection, the one who carries the story forward. And the story we've explored tonight, the possibility of humans in South America 80,000 years earlier than we thought, is part of your story now, part of what you know and wonder about, part of how you understand the deep past and its mysteries. So let it rest in you, this knowledge, this uncertainty, this openness to possibility. Let it shape how you think about history, about evidence, about narratives and their revision. Let it remind you that the past is not fixed and known but dynamic and open, always being rediscovered, always being reinterpreted. And let it connect you to those ancient people, whoever they were, whenever they arrived, who walked shores and climbed mountains and painted caves and left their marks in the earth for us to find. They are with us, in a sense, whenever we think about them, whenever we ask about them, whenever we honor their presence by seeking to understand it. They are not truly gone as long as we remember, as long as we ask, as long as we tell their stories. And so we keep them alive, these ghosts of deep time, these shadows in the archaeological record, these possible early Americans who may or may not have been there 80,000 years ago but who haunt the edges of our knowledge, who call to us from the deep layers, who remind us that there is always more to discover, always more to understand. The night is deep, and time is vast, and the questions are endless. But we are here, conscious and curious, asking and seeking and telling, doing what humans do, what we have always done, reaching back into the past and forward into the future, trying to make sense of it all, trying to find our place in the great story. And in that trying, in that reaching, in that endless questioning, we find meaning, purpose, connection. We find what it means to be human, to be aware of time, to care about where we came from and where we are going. This is the gift and the burden of consciousness, to know that we are part of something larger, something that extends beyond our individual lives, something that connects us to all those who came before and all those who will come after. And we honor that gift by using it, by asking the hard questions, by seeking the difficult answers, by refusing to be satisfied with ignorance or comfortable myths. We honor it by doing what we have done tonight, exploring deep time, engaging with mystery, holding evidence and narrative in tension, embracing uncertainty as opportunity rather than obstacle. This is what it means to be a seeker, a questioner, a lover of deep history and unsettling truths. And if you have listened this far, if you have journeyed with me through 15,000 words of speculation and evidence and philosophical reflection on early humans in South America, then you are one of us, one of the seekers. Welcome. This is your community, your tribe, the ones who cannot stop asking, who cannot accept simple answers, who need to know, even when knowing is impossible, even when the best we can do is approximate and revise and keep searching. We are the rememberers, and this is our work, and it is never finished, and that is exactly as it should be. Because if we ever stopped asking, if we ever believed we knew everything, if we ever closed the book on the past and declared it settled, we would have lost something essential to our humanity. We would have stopped being seekers and become merely inheritors, passive recipients of a fixed story rather than active participants in its ongoing construction. And that would be a tragedy, a loss of what makes us most fully human. So we keep asking, keep seeking, keep wondering. We ask, what if humans reached South America 80,000 years earlier? And in asking, we keep alive the possibility, the mystery, the sense of wonder that comes from confronting the deep past and its secrets. And whether the answer is yes or no, whether the evidence eventually confirms or refutes the possibility, the asking will have been worthwhile. Because it kept us curious, kept us humble, kept us connected to the long human story and our place in it. And that is enough. That is everything. So rest now or rise or continue in whatever way you continue. Carry these questions with you, these mysteries, these connections to deep time. Let them shape how you see the world, how you understand history, how you think about who we are and where we came from. And know that by caring about these questions, by engaging with them, by being willing to sit with uncertainty and complexity, you are contributing to the larger human project of self-understanding. You are part of the great conversation that spans generations, the ongoing dialogue between past and present, evidence and interpretation, data and meaning. You are a rememberer, a seeker, a keeper of the long story. And that is a worthy thing to be, perhaps the worthiest thing, because it connects you to everything that came before and everything that will come after, makes you part of the continuity, the lineage, the great human journey through time. So thank you for listening, for caring, for being here, for being part of this. Wherever you are in the world, whatever your story, you are part of ours now, and we are part of yours. And together we keep the questions alive, keep the search going, keep the memory burning in the darkness. A small flame against the vast night of time, but a flame nonetheless. A light that says we were here, we wondered, we asked, we sought, we remembered. And that is enough. That is everything. That is what it means to be human. Sleep well or wake well or continue well in whatever way you continue. The questions will be here when you return, waiting, patient, eternal. And we will be here too, still asking, still seeking, still telling the stories that connect us to the deep past and the distant future, still honoring those who came before by refusing to let them be forgotten. This is our work, our gift, our purpose. And we will continue it, as long as there are humans to ask, to seek, to remember. As long as there is deep time to explore, and mysteries to engage, and stories to tell. Forever.